Hello, my name is Verity. Welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to share with you my reading wrap up for the month of February. I've moved to the kitchen today because it's apparently where we keep the light at this part of the day, so I just thought it'd be better for filming purposes. The first book I wanted to talk to you about is The Perfect Stranger by Megan Miranda. I listened to this book on audio, which I've been getting back into audiobooks this last month while I've been going out for walks and watching my daughter's swimming lessons, and this was just a book that I chose completely at random off my library's BorrowBox app. So in this book we follow a woman named Leah Stevens, and we learn that she's been a journalist and she's moved to this really small town in Pennsylvania, and she's moved to get away from some kind of mistake that she's made in her former life. We don't find out at the beginning what that is, but it's gradually revealed as the story goes along. But she's made some kind of mistake that could have got her in big trouble, so she decides to run away and start a new life. She runs away with her friend Emmy Gray, who's this girl that she met at university, I think, and she's something of one of those like free spirit types, and she persuades her to move just by apparently throwing a dart into the map and just saying, right, we'll go there and we'll start a new life. So they move into this little cottage. It's a really small town, everybody seems to know everybody else, and Leah takes up a job as a teacher in the local high school. Emmy is cleaning houses and working at this motel. One day this woman named Bethany is found by the lake bleeding. At first it's thought she's been hit by a car because there's a patch of blood in the grass, but then it's revealed that she's actually been hit around the head with something heavy, and she's in hospital and in a coma and probably not likely to regain consciousness. Leah is surprised to realise that this woman Bethany bears a really striking resemblance to her, and then they start asking around at the school if anybody knows anything, and Leah reveals that this guy who works there, who's kind of like a janitor custodian type, has been pursuing her, like giving her unwanted romantic attention and like calling her house late at night, and he's married and she's not really interested, but he's been leaving her like silent voicemails and creeping her out, so that she tells them about that. And this detective who's in charge of looking into the case, Kyle Donovan, says that it's possible that this guy who's possibly stalking her has hit Bethany thinking that it was Leah. So Leah's quite concerned about that, as you would be. And then she goes back home to her house and she's like leaves post-it notes for Emmy, because they're kind of like ships that pass in the night. They have busy schedules. Emmy often works during the evenings, so they leave post-it notes for each other. And when she gets home one day, Leah realises that a post-it note that she's left for Emmy that talks about wanting her to pay the rent and the rent is overdue has gone unread on the table, and it's only then that she realises that the other post-it notes that she's been leaving pinned up against this like notice board that they use have been actually falling off down the side. They've not been picked up by Emmy at all, and she thinks, where is Emmy? And then she realises that she hasn't actually seen her for the best part of 5 days, so she reports her missing. Detective Kyle Donovan starts looking into the case, but then they realise that there's no paper trail for Emmy, there's no record of her having lived in the town, everything like the lease and her car isn't in her name, there's no record of her having existed at all, and then people start to get a little bit suspicious that Emmy never existed in the first place. This was a kind of mixed bag of a book for me. I expected it to be more of a thriller, but it was actually more probably of a dark mystery, I would say, as we tried to find out like who knows what in this small town and what's going on, and whether there really was an Emmy or whether there's an unreliable narrator in Leah. I sometimes felt as though the author introduced people and characters as simply as red herrings rather than to actually build on the atmosphere and the plot in any way, and I kind of felt at times the plot was getting a little bit too complicated and you were thinking like, wait, who's this now? What's happening here? I don't think that was just me like being dumb and not listening to it properly. I think it was a case of it being kind of a bit too contrived and a little bit almost as if it was deliberately trying to confuse the reader. However, I didn't think this book was badly written at all. It was a really well written book and I liked the voice of the story. And I also liked the themes that it raised in terms of how when we go to situations like university or moving in house shares with people, that we're likely to kind of go all in with that friendship when we don't actually know very much about those people at all. University halls of residence situations where you're thrust together with these people, you don't really know anything about them and yet you're suddenly sharing big chunks of your life together. So it raised interesting questions about that. I also thought it was interesting to think about the way that we present ourselves to other people, and the fact that people that we know in different parts of our lives might know different things about us and know different versions of ourselves, so that was really interesting to think about. So all in all, I didn't think this book was a complete waste of time. I didn't think it was the best book I've ever read. It was just kind of in the middle. It was an enjoyable listen and I was glad that I got to it and listened to it. The next book I wanted to talk to you about was The Other Emily by Dean Koontz. This was a random library read. I just went into our local library and it was sitting there on the shelf. I'd heard brief things about it, but I hadn't really paid it much attention when it came out last year. However, when I picked it up and looked at the blurb, I realised it sounded right up my street. It said it was about this girl who went missing and was presumably the victim of a serial killer who abducted women along America's highways. So I thought, oh, that sounds really good, I'll get that. So I did, I borrowed it and I read it for February, and it was kind of mixed for me. In this book we follow David, who's a novelist, and he's haunted by the fact that his girlfriend, Emily, went missing 10 years ago and she was presumably abducted by the serial killer called Ronnie Lee Jessup. He's particularly guilt-stricken because she went missing by herself. She'd broken down on the highway in a Buick. It was a stormy night. She was abducted while she was stranded, and he just feels really guilty that he wasn't there to help her when she needed him, and now she's gone forever. However, as David is getting on with his life a decade later, he goes into this restaurant and there he sees this woman who is not just a lookalike for Emily, she's like her in every way that he begins to suspect that she actually is her, and she's somehow come back 10 years later, having not aged a day, and has somehow made her way back into his life. This book I thought started out really, really strongly. We've got David who is haunted and consumed by this guilt, and he goes to visit the serial killer, Ronnie Lee Jessup, in prison because he was a really prolific killer, and David hopes that one day he's going to trust him enough and build up a kind of rapport with him, enough to reveal where he's hidden the last, I think it was 14 bodies that he's never given up, one of which they think is probably Emily's. So when we've got these scenes where David is visiting the prison and we're introduced to Jessup, the serial killer, and also this scene where David actually goes to this house where Jessup held his victims hostage and just did awful things to them in this basement, those scenes are particularly strong and it opened the book really, really well, I thought. We're introduced to the serial killer in prison, chained to the table as he goes to visit him, and he's just the worst person. He gives you really creepy, awful vibes. At first you kind of feel sorry for him because the author says that he's got like this teddy bear exterior, but then you see what he's like on the inside as he talks to David, and it's just really chilling. It's like almost Hannibal Lecter-esque in the way that he's described. And similarly with the scene in the basement where David goes down to kind of see if he can look for any leads in this house of horrors, he gets down into this basement and he becomes really claustrophobic in this maze that the killer made years before, and he gets really overwhelmed. And that scene is absolutely terrifying. I read it in bed at night and it was really, really scary. I just thought it was so frightening. So I thought that the book opened up particularly well. However, I think where the story started to weaken for me was when David met this woman who he thinks is Emily, who's actually calling herself Madison. I felt like she wasn't written in a very realistic way at all. We're not quite sure throughout whether she is Emily or whether she's Madison or what's going on, but there was too much kind of is she, isn't she, and he seems to fall in love with her the instant he sees her rather than being like suspicious, even though he is kind of convinced that she is Emily, and so he would have that kind of feeling maybe towards her. It just doesn't feel quite right. I don't think there was enough setup of him wondering if she is her to kind of suspend our disbelief, that kind of attitude towards her. And she also talks in a really, really old-fashioned way that I didn't find very realistic at all. In fact, it was quite irritating. So in the middle of the book, it really started to slow down for me, and I was thinking, I'm not liking this at all. I don't think I'm going to give it a very high rating. However, then for the final, probably third of the book, maybe just after halfway, it started to really pick up again, and I think that the ending definitely saved this book for me. We get David finally making a few decisions, and he goes to some different places and tries to track down what's going on, and I think I really liked the kind of supernatural aspect of the ending. So as I say, that really saved this book. It saved it from being like a 2-star read at the midway point to being a much better book overall, and one that I was definitely glad that I picked up. Next on the list was The Plot by Jean Hanff Korelitz. I had already heard really excellent things about this book last year from the BookTube community, and this was another one that I found in the local library, so I decided to pick it up and give it a go, and I was definitely not disappointed. I felt it definitely lived up to the hype. In this book we follow Jacob Finch Bonner, who is a novelist who's become somewhat washed up. When he's a young man, he's written this really amazing novel and everybody starts tipping him as like a young novelist to watch and a success story for the future, but he finds he never really follows up on the success that he enjoyed initially. And by the time we meet him, he's washed up, he's not sure what he's going to do next, he's not doing terribly well for himself. So he takes this job at a community college teaching creative writing to students who also want to become novelists. And there he meets this really obnoxious, awful student called Evan, who doesn't think he needs to really be there. He doesn't really take any notice of the course plan. He just wants to, he claims he has this amazing idea for a plot and just wants to get it written up basically and become the star that he knows he's going to be. Jacob just thinks he's an idiot at first, but then one day Evan finally opens up to him and tells him the story that he's devised, and Jacob realises that it is the best thing since sliced bread and he's probably going to become a massive star, so he's kind of grumpy and annoyed about that, but they go off and go their separate ways. Sometime later we rejoin Jake and he suddenly starts to wonder why he's never seen Evan in any media appearances, why he never became a successful novelist, and why he never heard this amazing story with its incredible plot anywhere else. So he goes on the internet and gives Evan a Google and discovers that not only did Evan not write the book, but he actually died like 3 months after their conversation in which he revealed the incredible plot to him. Meanwhile, Jacob, who's still feeling washed up and hasn't got any ideas what he's going to do next, then realises that there's this incredible plot up for grabs that he could probably pinch for himself. So he pinches this plot, he writes it up, it becomes a success, but somebody knows what he's done and somebody is threatening to expose him to the world as a fraud. I found this book surprisingly suspenseful given that there's not a lot of action, it's not like your classic thriller, but it really is very suspenseful as Jacob starts to unravel and wonder who is blackmailing him and whether they do know, and then when they're going to expose him as they threaten to. He goes on this cross-country journey to try and find out the truth and goes back to where he used to teach and find out more about Evan, and it turns into a really exciting novel that you just can't stop turning the pages to find out what happens. I also thought it was really beautifully written and had a really nice kind of wry humour to it that added to the overall enjoyment of the book. It's one that I flew through in a couple of days and would definitely recommend, and I really enjoyed thinking afterwards about the questions of story ownership and who owns the tales that we tell ourselves and the stories that we hear in our everyday lives. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this book and picking it up if you've wondered about it and heard all the hype but aren't sure whether it's worth it, because it definitely is. The next book was Later by Stephen King. This is one I'd really been looking forward to getting to. Anything by Stephen King I'm always on board with. And this was another one. In fact, all of these books this month have been library finds. So this was one I found at the local library and picked it up. I thought I might as well squeeze it in, push it in front of all the books I'm supposed to be reading on my massive overloaded bookshelves. This is another one of Stephen King's stories from the Hard Case Crime imprint that he sometimes publishes with. He did Joyland under that imprint, I think. But this one is really more on the side of horror rather than crime, I would say. In this book we follow Jamie. We join him as a young boy and we discover that he's got this gift where he can see dead people for a while after they pass away. Only him and his mother know about it because she thinks it's something that they should probably keep a secret. But he frequently sees people after they've died. For instance, the woman who lives in the same apartment block as him and his mother, he sees her. And he also sees strangers even as they pass by on the street if they've recently died, which can be quite scary for him. So for instance, we have this man he sees as a cyclist who's been run over, and he sees them in the kind of state that they've died, so it's not always particularly nice for Jamie. So as I said, only Jamie and his mum know that he's got this secret ability to see dead people, until Jamie's mum starts to struggle. She's a literary agent and things start to go a bit pear-shaped for her in terms of her business, and the big author who she's been the agent for and who's been writing this series of critically acclaimed books passes away without completing the next in the series. She knows he had the idea, she knew how it was going to be finished off, but he dies before he actually does it. So she employs Jamie to go to this man's house with her and to ask the man after he's dead what his intentions were for this series that he's been writing, so she can write it and finish it off. In doing this, Jamie and his mum kind of reveal Jamie's gift to Jamie's mum's girlfriend Liz, who's a cop. They're together at the time and she goes along for the ride with them, so she finds out what's going on. She doesn't really believe it at the time until Jamie is talking to this guy and passing on the information from the book, and then she kind of starts to believe that it probably is true. Time passes by after Jamie's done this little job for his mum, and the book is a success. She manages to write it and finish the series, and nobody notices that anything has gone on untoward. But Jamie's mum and her girlfriend Liz then split up. Sometime later, he finds out that Liz has been into some bad things as a cop. She's kind of been taking bribes. She's become a dirty cop and she's getting in trouble. Then one day she effectively kidnaps Jamie. She takes Jamie to see this guy who was a terrorist and had been planting bombs all over the city, and he's recently committed suicide, but not before planting a massive final bomb. And she takes Jamie to kind of talk to him in spirit and find out where this bomb is planted, because these people after they're dead, they can't tell lies. They have to tell Jamie what he asks them. They tell him the truth. So Jamie finds out where this bomb is planted and is a hero, or Liz is a hero rather, because she is the one who reveals it. But unfortunately, in talking to this bomber, this terrorist, Jamie becomes haunted by him and is unable to shake him, and things just progress from there. I absolutely loved this book. I thought it was really good in tone. I really like the character of Jamie and his descriptions of how he deals with his special gift. I thought it had echoes of Carrie and the other stories in which Stephen King's visited this theme of kids having special abilities, like The Institute as well. It's something he keeps going back to, and it's one of my kind of favourite tropes of his. There's also a lot of Easter eggs in here for Stephen King's constant readers, definitely in terms of It, which I won't spoil because it's a nice surprise when you get to it. And also I thought there was a little nod to Insomnia here, where Jamie is looking out the window and sees this man underneath the street lamp. I thought that was kind of echoes of that book where the man with insomnia, I think it's Ralph possibly, is looking out the window and also sees someone standing there. So I think that was kind of hopefully intentional and hopefully that what that was meant to be. There are also some really scary scenes in here that definitely made it more of towards that kind of horror that Stephen King is best at, rather than simply the crime of, say, like Finders Keepers or Joyland. However, I will say that the very final 4 pages, without giving you any spoilers, did kind of put me off giving the book a full 5 stars. In fact, the very, very end really spoilt the whole thing if I'm gonna think about how it ended. There's a really shocking reveal at the end, again no spoilers, but I just felt it was kind of just there purely to shock. And I know he does that. He does like to shock you with his endings and with his big reveals, but I just thought that this one was kind of unsavoury and a little bit off-putting. We were kind of sympathetic towards that character throughout, and then we were kind of thrown this curveball, and I just didn't think it was in keeping with the story. So that kind of knocked it off being a full 5-star complete enjoyment of a book for me, unfortunately. But I think when I think back on this book, I'm going to kind of disregard those final 4 pages and just think about the rest of the book, because that was a huge success. And finally, the last book for me to talk to you about today is And Then You Were Gone by R.J. Jacobs. This turned out to be my absolute favourite book of the month, and one that I was really glad I stumbled upon. Actually, I came upon this book by accident. I was looking on Instagram one day, just browsing through the books, and I saw this advert for a book that had a really striking cover, so I kind of made a note of the author's name, thought, oh, I'll look into that at some point. And then purely by chance, when I was browsing through the BorrowBox app from the library, just looking for another audiobook, I found a different book by R.J. Jacobs, And Then You Were Gone, and thought, well, that's weird, what a funny coincidence, I'll just download that. And without even really bothering to check the synopsis or what it was about, I thought I would just give it a go. And I was really so glad I did, because, as I say, this was my best book of the month. So in this story we follow a woman named Emily Firestone. We find out early on that she's got bipolar disorder and she's on medication for that, so we kind of have a unreliable narrator trope, which is always a good one that I find. And she's going out with this guy called Paolo, who's from Argentina, and he works in the medical field. He's kind of a microbiology researcher. Paolo's been on at her to go on this trip with him. He wants to go on a boat ride on the lake, like a little overnight trip on this yacht, but Emily's not keen because her grandmother, who also had bipolar disorder, tried to drown herself one day and had to be rescued, and it's kind of traumatised Emily from being a child, and so she's scared of the water, so she doesn't really want to go. But Paolo keeps on at her, and eventually she decides she'll relent and she will go on this trip, although she's not going to, under any circumstances, get in the water. So all's going well and they're having a really nice time, and Paolo's already dived in to get some keys out that this family have dropped who were passing by and dropped the keys in the ward, so he just dives in to get them. And so Emily and Paolo have a drink of wine on board the boat and they settle down for the night, but when Emily wakes up she realises that Paolo is completely missing. He's nowhere to be found on the boat. She's got a bit of a headache, she doesn't feel so good, but she knows she didn't drink a lot, and Paolo is just vanished. So she goes back to the marina to raise the alarm that he's gone, and nobody can find any sign of him, and eventually she's kind of forced to go back to where she lives without him and to kind of resume her life, all the while thinking he wouldn't have drowned like they said they think he did, and wondering what's going on. It was kind of unexpected for me that she went back to her everyday life and resumed where she left off, because I'd not really looked into the synopsis. I kind of assumed that the whole thing would be set by the lake as they looked for him, but it turned out that it was set over a much longer time period and that she had to kind of do what many relatives of missing people do and just carry on going about their everyday life even when somebody is missing, so that was quite interesting. However, Emily's convinced that Paolo wouldn't have drowned and she thinks there's more to his disappearance, so she starts trying to look into it, all the while she's getting in more trouble herself because she's distraught at the loss of Paolo. She has to go to his funeral. She starts drinking too much, she's in a car accident and gets in trouble for that and is really badly injured, and things just start to stack up against her. And so all the time she's kind of arguing that there's more to this disappearance. We're not quite sure whether she's an unreliable narrator still and whether she knows more than she's letting on at first, or the other characters definitely aren't sure whether she's telling the truth and she can be relied upon, and they don't believe her either, even when we later do. So you get that feeling that everybody's against her and she's got to fight to get to the truth. I absolutely loved this book. I thought it was really exciting, really well done, cleverly plotted. It gave me the same kind of vibes as The Fugitive, which is one of my favourite all-time films, and also Enemy of the State, in terms of the main characters in real trouble. Nobody believes what's going on. They're trying to fight for justice and to get to the bottom of things, all the while against all these obstacles that keep getting thrown in front of them. The ending is really dramatic, but in a very good way. A little bit over the top, but only in like a Hollywood thriller ending style way. It doesn't feel out of keeping with the rest of the book. And this is overall just one that I was really glad I stumbled across, and I will definitely be looking out for more books by R.J. Jacobs in the future because I was so impressed with this one. Okay, that's it for this month's reading wrap up. I hope you enjoyed hearing about these books and it's given you some inspiration for books you might like to pick up yourself in the future. Please do like and comment on this video if you enjoyed it, and consider subscribing to my channel as it helps me out a lot. And in the meantime, happy reading. I'll see you again in the next video. Bye!